Hey, this is Michael Wiley, and you're listening to Devy Devotion.
Welcome in to the Devy Devotional Podcast, a show devoted to all things Devy and C2C. Hosted by John Arrington and Aaron Wilcox. This dynamic duo brings you actionable strategies with player-driven analysis for your Devy and C2C leagues. Let's dive in.
Let's dive in to Devy Risers. Welcome into the Devy Devotional, where we stay devoted to Devy. I'm your host, Dynasty Coach A, joined as always by Aaron Wilcox at Aaron Wilcox86 on Twitter. And tonight, like I said, we're going to be talking about some risers in our ranks, some players that maybe we didn't give enough credit to last year, and now we're going to go ahead and fix that problem. Maybe even just in the past couple months, we're sitting here going, hey, it's time to correct this, right this wrong, correct these ranks, and we're going to go ahead and do that tonight. But first, of course, we have to check in with Aaron, and then, it's been a little while since we recorded. Maybe we can get into a little bit of Senior Bowl talk before we dive into these risers.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially since we had that great shout out on the intro, Michael Wiley. You can tell us a little bit about that, John. But yes, excited for the Risers podcast tonight.
Absolutely. That was so much fun going down to the Senior Bowl. It's something I would love to do every year if I can. Not only was it just really cool being able to interview all the players and just taking it all in, watching them all play and everything, but there were certain things that I feel like you just cannot see on TV. You can't see in a box score, you can't see regardless, and you really have to be there to get the feel. Even sometimes it was just like other analysts and other media people talking about a certain player, and you just like, okay, there's 20 guys that all have a consensus feel on this player. Like that gives me a pretty good idea about how we all feel about him. So yeah, there were so many things we could probably talk about it for an hour. People probably have heard every Senior Bowl thing over the past like week or so. So we probably don't have to, but we could. But is there anything you want to pick my brain about the Senior Bowl that you haven't already heard, or or maybe you think that I might have a little more of a feel for?
Yeah, well, and I just think it's kind of an interesting scenario for somebody, excuse me, like yourself, who's a primarily data-driven, data first at least, analyst, and being that that's just not at all really part of the analysis at that event. I was kind of curious on if whether it's changed your mind on your process or added further nuance, or if there were like big takeaways for whether it's your process or just like how you can go into an event like that being a guy who prioritizes the data over watching film or like footwork or very qualitative qualities.
Sure. There's certain things like I interviewed Marshawn Lloyd for about 7 minutes. Unfortunately, the audio is garbage, so I don't think you'll ever hear it. I'm going to try and put it through like a software or something and see if I can't clean it up. But I learned my lesson about not having like a legit mic for next time. So. But I talked. He talked to everyone. He was really super cool about everything. Like he was willing to answer any questions. He stayed after. They were like, "All right, guys, he's not going to take any more questions." And then he went like 2 feet to the right, and then he stayed there for like another hour answering everybody's questions. So, he was the coolest guy. But I asked him, obviously, like you had a great career, college career and everything. So why are you at the Senior Bowl? And he said, honestly, like look at USC this past year. There's studs everywhere at every single position, and it's really tough to like truly stand out. And on top of that, they didn't really need him, especially in like the passing game, because that wasn't really their style. They weren't dinking and dunking. Caleb Williams isn't throwing it 3 yards; he's throwing it 50. And so he said he came to the Senior Bowl to showcase that he has that receiving game. He has that receiving ability that he didn't necessarily get to show off at USC, in his college career. And so that kind of thing, no box score. Honestly, no film watching is necessarily going to be able to show you that. But no box score is going to be able to show you that either. So that's definitely something that like I said, there's certain things that I feel like you kind of have to be there to get that feel and everything. But I will say, being more of a box score watcher, metrics based analyst, whatever you want to call me, nerd. Like I don't like, obviously I watch football. I know how to. I played football, and like I know all about football. That's not really the problem. That's just not my game. Like I don't scout that way. But I also feel like I went in fresh by not having any kind of ideas about how a certain player does a certain thing or whatever it might have been. And so I was able to just go watch them play football and, like, and almost like learn from, day one, like, okay, who is this person? And, you saw Lad McConkey on day one in the 1v1s and he's just tearing people up. But the DBs were giving him so much space and I don't really know why. And so it looked amazing and everyone's freaking out. Okay, Lad McConkey's going to be the MVP of the Senior Bowl. He's probably going to walk away after day one. Well, he didn't. And then day two, they go 11v11 and all of a sudden he's just getting destroyed at the line of scrimmage, like can't get off press, can't do anything. And so it's like, all right, well, A, don't take everything away from one day. B, probably don't take too much away from 1v1s. And C, like we really need to look at, a grand work and not just like one or two things, like that kind of thing. So I really enjoyed the week. It was really cool. But, just picking up on certain things like that was definitely eye-opening for me. And, like I said, something I'd like to do for years to come if I can.
Yeah, that's great analysis there, great experience, and I do like that takeaway that you had. It's like these guys have a whole career worth of production and highlights and reps and things for you to watch. So sometimes don't get too caught up, like you said, in like the one-on-ones and like, maybe some of the buzzwords that you'll hear from, everybody and their mother who was, either watching the highlights or, analyzing the videos that you were taking or other people there who are actually there in person. What they were seeing. So it's one of those deals where it's part of the process. It's not the whole process. So I'm glad you got that experience, and it sounds like you had some great takeaways.
Yeah, and there's just certain things like I ended up running into Monty Bailey's family and talking with them for like 30 minutes while during the game, and he had a huge play while we were sitting there talking. I'm high-fiving and hugging the family and everything. Just an amazing story, at the very least, but just such a cool experience to be there with the family while he's doing, while he's on the field, and they're sitting there telling me about his mom's track background and how, like she's helping coach him on how to run the 40 properly. So that makes me feel like he's going to run a fast 40. And we know that NFL teams love that, and dynasty players love that. So, like Amani Bailey isn't getting a lot of love right now, but I mean, he's somebody that could really, if he runs a 4.38, like they were kind of talking about, then, like he's going to skyrocket up boards.
Yeah, he's a fun player too. Not to get into too much of the rookie class, but I mean, yeah, I've liked him like as a sleeper for a long time, and I think you and I both have really come around to the idea of Marshawn Lloyd as like a top upper tier back in this class too.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, like I said, it was a lot of fun. I hope I can do it again next year. I hope to have more experience and bring, microphones and all that kind of stuff so I can bring back better audio, more audio, and just have, I'll know what to do next year. Let's just put it that way. This year there was a lot of learning going on, but it was just such a cool experience. So I think that is enough about the Senior Bowl, though. A few minutes on it, but we're here to talk about Devy players tonight, and we're here to talk about some risers. Maybe some of them you've heard of. I would say there's at least a handful you've probably never heard of, or at the very least that we've never mentioned on this podcast. And so I think that's always interesting. That's always fun because I always hate when not to say that it's not important to talk about the best players, obviously, but I hate when we end up talking like 3 pods in a row about the same player. And it's like, oh, well, like I feel like I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. So we're here tonight to talk about that. But Aaron, why don't you go ahead and start us off with your first riser, any position. I don't care if you want to start with the QBs. I know you had said you only had one, I believe, unless you added to it after that. You want to start with the QBs, we can, but any position, whatever you want to start with is fine by me.
Sure. Well, since you mentioned QBs, let's do that. And I just had one, and I'll kind of explain that reasoning for why I only had one riser. It's like we have all this uncertainty right now with the Devy QB landscape, and I think that's the biggest reason was we haven't really seen one guy really emerge and rise a whole lot. Like all of these guys, we had this mass exodus basically of all this quarterback talent that's coming out this year. And now we're kind of left with these unproven guys. And I haven't identified a lot of guys that I've or that the community or myself have moved up just a ton. Like there's been small movers, but I was already high on Jackson Arnold. Like he hasn't risen at all. It's just like in I mean, relation to where he was going last year in ADP, I guess, like you could technically mention him as a riser, I guess, but at the end of the day, nothing recently or even from his performances last season has made me hugely like adjust that opinion on him. Or same with like Nico. Like, I mean, I liked his flashes, but I already had him pretty high. So for me, I will say one guy in this process who hasn't even stepped foot on the field yet in college is Damon Williams, Washington, formerly an Arizona commit, but now to Washington as Jed Fish kind of swapped that around. And I just think that Damon Williams is a really, really fun, dynamic player. You'll be very surprised, or maybe not so surprised to see, like in high school, he was a very good passer as well. A guy who is known for being like a smaller quarterback, like 5'11-ish, 180, and just dynamic on the ground. But like he had a great senior season. I mean, he completed 76% of his passes, a 34-3 touchdown to interception ratio, 1,100 plus rushing yards and 20 rushing touchdowns. Like the guy's a Konami code. And I get that he's small, but I think we need to kind of move past that to some degree and say guys like Kyler Murray can work out and at the NFL level. Guys like Bryce Young can go like number 1, number 2 overall, like in the draft. And a guy like Damon Williams, who had some actually very good offers. I'm not saying like he was recruited by like, I mean, still very high end teams like Oregon and obviously Arizona, Washington. Him flipping over, I think there's opportunity for him there. Jed Fish, he's had some recent success with smaller quarterbacks, and I really don't think that Will Rogers is that good of a quarterback. So we could even see Damon Williams year 1. So I just really fell in love with watching him play, and the statistics, the production really backs that up. And he's just rising in this class, and I don't really see a lot of people talking about him either. But for me, he's my QB5 in this incoming freshman class. So I think for some that's really quite high. But I mean, he was an upper tier 4-star recruit and really wildly varies for rankings amongst the industry. But I guess rivals did have him at QB4 as well. So there are a lot of things to like with Damon Williams. But did that selection shock you at all, John?
I mean, I won't say it shocked me because I honestly don't even know who he is, but in my quick research here, you know me, I'm not the best with the recruits, but in my quick research here, we got Hollywood in the chat. DCA. Hey, Aaron's here too. Don't forget about Aaron here. What's up, Hollywood? And obviously Toronto Dave's in the chat, and Beth We Trust, of course. But to your point, Will Rogers is not the greatest quarterback in the history of the world. I think he has proven that he's a very good game manager, and I guess it's really going to depend on what Fish wants. If that's what he wants, then he's probably just going to stick with Rogers. If he's looking for somebody that's going to be pushing it down the field and doing more with it, then I feel like you have a really good case to make for Damon Williams. I don't know, like I said, I don't really know much about the player, besides what you just told me. But all I can say is, I have, at least in the past year, I have, like a pretty good case to be made where, I wasn't all in on Jackson Dart, but I was all out on Spencer Sanders. And so him coming over didn't scare me at all. And I'm like, no, it's still going to be Jackson Dart's game. And so you're kind of doing the same thing where maybe you don't necessarily think that Damon Williams is like the greatest quarterback in the history of the world, but you know that you don't believe in Will Rogers. And so you're kind of just betting on at some point it's going to, switch over to that. And I don't mind that. Like I said, I just had a pretty good experience with that as well. And Hollywood does say, hey, Aaron, for everyone. So what's up, buddy? But yeah, I mean, to your point, like at the very least, we know that they're going to want, like Jed Fish is going to want to put his name, his stamp on Washington because they've already, they were at the national championship. Like there's probably high expectations, high hopes, all that kind of stuff. He can't go out and win 3 games. Like he cannot do that. He would just be, he would be, lit at the stake. And that's not right. English, whatever it is. But he will be murdered basically is what I'm trying to say. And so Yeah, I feel like he will be very Will Rogers will have a very short leash when it's all said and done. Is that kind of where you're getting at? Or I mean, have you really seen something? Did you watch his high school tape? Did you see something that you really think like he can be that guy?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know if it was even as much about Will Rogers at all, and just saying that this guy is like so so fun to watch in high school. And when you get a guy who's just very accurate and very very dynamic as a rusher, and also he's not a rushing quarterback. Let me make that clear. He is a pass first quarterback who also happens to be extremely dynamic on the ground. That's exciting. That is like Caleb Williams going out there. Caleb Williams is not known for this guy to be like choosing to rush all the time. Like, no, he's eluding guys in the pocket. He's running outside of the pocket, but he's keeping his eyes downfield. He's able to make passes, getting outside of the pocket, playing outside of structure. And I felt that, Damon, he can get more consistent with that, sure, but he was consistently demonstrating that ability as a passer, which was just, that's what puts him ahead of like a Jalen Milroe. So if you hear a podcast, if you hear a source out there say, okay, that's the comp for Damon Williams, that's not accurate at all. Because I mean, Jalen Milroe has never been a high percentage passer in his career. He's just never been efficient. Like, yeah, he has a decent arm, he has great mobility, but like Damon Williams, he has the accuracy as well, which I thought was really interesting. And arm strength. I saw him throw a ball 70 yards. No, actually, yeah, I think it was like 65, 70. Like it was just a huge, huge arm talent at times with him, which I thought was really interesting. So it was at least, 60, 65 yards. And just with those other traits, I think that he has some specialness to his game. We'll see if that actually translates.
I mean, to be fair, I've seen Joe Milton throw a ball 70 yards, and I want nothing to do with Joe Milton, but I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
And
but Joe Milton has like a 30%, completion
No, I
percentage,
know.
right?
I know. It's just funny, but yeah, I mean, he has all the prospects to be what we want somebody to be in the NFL, like all that kind of stuff. So I love the call. I'm excited for him. I didn't ever really feel like Will Rogers really made sense, like bringing him over to Washington. But we'll see what happens there. And burned at the stake were the English words that I was trying to put together in that sentence, and I did not do a very good job at not whatever the hell I said. But since we already brought him up, or at least I already brought him up, and we're already talking about QBs, I'll just go ahead and talk about my first riser. And once again, it was somebody that I didn't necessarily love last season going into the season, but I was just like, I think he's good enough. Like he should be talked about more. He should be in at least the conversation of being a Devy QB, like that kind of thing. And it was Jackson Dart, and now all of a sudden I feel like everyone has Jackson Dart on their radars and everyone's moved him up. But I don't think it's enough. I feel like everyone's just being a little too slow in moving him up because he's my QB1, my Devy QB1. Like, there's no one above him except, I mean, if you want to throw some random player that hasn't hardly seen the field or whatever ahead of him, I'm not really going to argue with you. But as far as people or players that have actually touched the field, thrown the ball more than like 4 times, like that kind of player, he has done the most. And he's hitting all the thresholds I want to see. Big time throw rate, intended air yards, PPR points per touch, interception rate, like all of that stuff. It's honestly the only thing that's really kind of like holding him back is he had a slow start to his career, and so like some of those like worst seasons are kind of holding him back. And he doesn't have the highest end numbers as far as like adjusted yards per attempt, but I mean he's right there like 10 adjusted yards per attempt. That's great. It's not perfect. It's not like amazing. It's not like the best thing we've ever seen. Jaden Daniels was at 13.1 adjusted yards per attempt this past season. So like, obviously that's a pretty big difference there. But it's good enough. We see him in the 80s for QBR. It's good enough. We see like he's hitting every single threshold. And yet people are like, oh, he's my QB 8 in Devy. They're not 8 QBs or 7 QBs that are better than Jackson Dart right now in Devy. I'm sorry. You're 100% projecting at that point. And I really, like I said, I just feel like people are just, they're too slow to move him up because they're scared. But, this is the same thing that happened with Jaden Daniels last year. Jaden Daniels was an afterthought. And then all of a sudden, Jaden Daniels was no longer an afterthought. JJ McCarthy was an afterthought. And I mean, even towards the end of the season, he was still an afterthought to a lot of people. But now you're starting to see all of a sudden he's starting to be talked about in the top 10 to 15 of the NFL draft, and that's obviously going to make even some of the non-believers believe, because, hey, he got the draft capital and he got this and that. That's the kind of stuff we're looking for. We're not saying that Jackson Dart's going to go in and be the best QB that's ever happened in the NFL draft or anything like that. I'm saying he is Devy viable and he needs to be higher in your ranks.
Yeah, and you know what? I love that, and I think you touched on it. And I would even maybe rephrase it like, yeah, people are scared maybe to move them up, or they're not very confident in that. But it's more like they've been burned before, right? They have that bias and that disappointment taste in their mouth from those previous instances where they did move him up, and then at first he wasn't so great, right, with his opportunities, 2 years ago. But now we gotta catch up to what he's done this last year. And we know that at Ole Miss, like, he's going to have the opportunity to throw the ball a lot this year too. So he's already going to build on, like you said, everything he's done has been very solid to this point, very safe in a QB landscape right now that's unproven and volatile. So I think that in this landscape right now, it makes sense to have him as an upper tier guy. He's a top 3 guy right now in all of Devy for me. Amongst the quarterbacks, that is. And I think that's very fair to have him at number 1. I can see that argument. And not to really segue away from that too much, but I'll say, well, I'll just come out and say one of my other risers. Like, I'll give you Trey Harris, Ole Miss. Now, this is a little deeper name, right? But Trey Harris is also going to be benefiting as probably the number 1 wide receiver in a Jackson Dart-led offense for Ole Miss. And guess what Ole Miss is missing this year? Well, they don't have Quinshon Judkins anymore. So that's probably going to boost that passing volume. Like, that's just going to allow this passing attack to probably get more volume overall. And they're also losing Dayton Wade, who I know, like, Wade's not like this good NFL prospect by any means, but at the end of the day, he was their second leading wide receiver last year. He had a whole lot of yards. And I think that, even though they're bringing over Antoine Wells, there's going to be weapons at Ole Miss. Trey Harris is still that incumbent number 1. He had a very solid market share last year, a very good 2.49 yards per team pass attempt, leading Ole Miss in touchdowns, receiving yards amongst the wide receivers last year. I think he just continues to bounce back, and the only reason he's going back to school another year, in my opinion, is that Trey Harris got injured and banged up this last season, and that really killed his momentum. Like, the statistics won't show that from a share standpoint, the impact of him being banged up this last year, because he was on pace for a really special season. But unfortunately, getting banged up did impact him. So I think that Trey Harris, as kind of a deeper guy, I still think he needs to be a riser for a lot of people in the industry. And I have surprisingly bumped him up more than I thought I would, but I'll have to refresh my ranks here, or at least look at my ranks. But I think I have him top 20-ish. I want to, 18th right now in all of Devy.
I love it. I love it. Honestly, I'll just come out with it and say he's actually my wide receiver 14. Now, that's not with any freshmen or anything like that. And there's probably even some other sophomores that didn't ever see the field that I probably end up putting ahead of them or whatever when it's all said and done. I actually considered talking about him tonight. I'm glad you did. But the only reason why I didn't is just because he's a 5th-year senior. That's really the only reason why. And I mean, I'm not hating on it. Like, I like the player. And like you said, if he goes out and does anything close to what he was on pace to do, then like he can just absolutely dominate this year. And that's going to go right along with, with Jackson Dart. And so like, that's great. I love that. I mean, a lot of times when you see them step up from Conference USA to the SEC, you kind of expect them to just kind of fall flat on their face, or at the very least just not quite be the same player. He got better in like every statistical category in the SEC. It's really weird, but I mean, he literally got better at every, and I mean, that's probably hats off to Jackson Dart, but like at least for part of it. But I mean, it just shows you that he's a quality player for sure.
Yeah. But I think that illustrates a great point about Harris as well, that he's able to make that step up and still outproduce guys who have been, P5 players, all that. So, certainly a lot to like there. But, well, I transitioned us over to wide receivers, but how about you leave off wherever you want to, John, with another guy?
No, I'll keep us with the wide receivers. It's another player. I promise not every player I talk about is going to be somebody I've talked about in the past couple pods, because I definitely have some sleepers there here at the end. But I'm just going to go ahead and get the first one out of the way. London Humphreys. I've talked about him a lot. I don't know if I've talked about him on our pod as much, but I've definitely talked about him on the Full Tilt Devy pod quite a bit. And he's transferring over to Georgia from Vanderbilt. We all know Vanderbilt's kind of the laughing stock of the SEC, but the funny thing is, I mean, they had three pretty legit receivers on their squad this past year, and Will Shepherd, Jaden McGowan, and then obviously London Humphreys as well. London Humphreys was a true freshman, and I mean, there were some injuries and stuff involved with really all of them, but Humphreys gets on the field, puts up what 437 yards, as a true freshman in an offense with AJ Swan got hurt. I mean, there was just a lot going on. Not the greatest offense in the world. The starting QB gets hurt. He's behind other players and everything. But one of the greatest things about Humphreys is, size and speed. And I don't even love those players as much, as maybe you or a normal film grinder would. But they see that 6'3" frame and they're like, oh man. And then they see him burning down the field and getting let's see here, 20.8 yards per reception. Like he's just burning down the field, showing that athleticism in the SEC. Like not just a crap competition or anything like that, but you see that, and now he's transferring over to Georgia. Now we know Georgia's not necessarily wide receiver U, but at the same time, we also know that Brock Bowers just left. Dominic Lovett's still there, but he's really more of like a slot receiver than anything else. I don't think anyone thinks of him as like a true alpha receiver or anything. And then, Lab McConkey just left. There's a lot of players, but Carson Beck's back. And a lot of people have Carson Beck as their QB1 right now in Devy, for Dynasty, for all that kind of stuff. So I really feel like if we're getting pretty excited about Beck and he kind of lost his athletic freak, player that he can rely on, maybe he's going to go with the athletic freak in London Humphreys. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it'd be super fun. And you're right. He's an athletic dude. Like he was very competitive in the 200-yard dash. Like he is a guy who's better with that top end speed than maybe the acceleration and, like the quickness and things like that. I will have to say, I mean, he's likely just going to be an outside guy, but at the end of the day, like you said, he made a big impact as a true freshman with some, fairly capable other wide receivers there in that room. I think probably my biggest hang up, and this isn't to say I dislike him because I like him as a shout out for this category for sure, because he needs to be a clear riser in the Devy landscape right now. Was just more so like at the end of the day, like his yards market share, his yards per team pass attempt, like they weren't necessarily sticking out. Like they were okay, right? At the end of the day, like you said, he has a good yards per reception, but like some of that was kind of skewed with his early season beating up against the bad competition, because once it went to SEC play, like besides that 49-yard touchdown against Georgia on a slant that he just took to the house, against, kind of just no defense there. They just let him open. Like he really struggled against Kentucky, the rest of the game against Georgia, Auburn, South Carolina, Tennessee. And that was a little bit concerning. I was hoping that he would just kind of build on that early season momentum, where he kind of beat up against a little weaker competition. So I guess that's the one caveat or the one thing that's making me a little bit more hesitant to move him up as like a top 15 Devy wide receiver or anything like that. But there is a lot of promise with him, and I think that's the stuff that you touched on, right? Like the upside is really tempting at Georgia, and he was ranked really highly, I think, in 247 as a wide receiver, like a transfer portal ranking or whatever. Like they considered him a high end guy in the transfer portal. So I think that tells us something about his talents as well.
Yeah, and remember, AJ Swan only played like 5 games before he got hurt, and then it was Ken Seals, and I mean, I think we can all agree that Ken Seals is not a quality quarterback. AJ Swan had more passing yards in those 5 games than Ken Seals did in the rest of the season. So it just kind of shows you that it was not great. So yes, Humphreys fell off later on in the season, but the entire team fell off. I mean, the only player that actually outplayed or out produced Humphreys was Will Shepherd, and he's a 5th-year senior. So maybe he was a 4th year last year. Now he's going to be a 5th-year senior. And so, like that just I mean, you would expect that. And he only beat him by like 100 and something yards, like maybe 150 yards, whatever it was. Like he had 600 and Humphreys had 437, whatever it is. I mean, even if you say 200 yards, ooh, the fourth year senior beat him by 200 yards. Like, I'm just saying, there's definitely some stuff that you can say. It's not a perfect, ideal situation, and you can't even point to it and say, "Oh yeah, he's a guaranteed stud." But there's a lot of things that pop off the page, and you go, "Man, I really like this player. He could be something."
Yeah, and that's a good point too. I guess I was looking at like some of the other guys who were putting up some production last year. Like you said, Will Shepherd, they're understandable, right? That he would outproduce Humphreys, but there's still McGowan and then like Junior Sherrill and Quincy Skinner, and I was a little bit kind of surprised to see that those guys were also eating into Humphrey's share, but I get it. Like the offense can't just only rely on like one or two guys. Like they have to spread the ball around somewhat, especially when it's not a very competent quarterback. So yeah, I think that's a good shout out there. That's for sure.
All right, who you got next? I mean, are you sticking with the wide receivers, or are you going somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll stick with the wide receivers. I will shout out Kevin Casey Concepcion. NC State wide receiver. And I mean, he's a guy who's been gaining a lot of traction, a lot more buzz nowadays in the Devy landscape, and he might be going in the top 2 to 3 rounds in startups even. He is a guy who you're going to hear some detractors or at least people, trying to pump the brakes on him this offseason because of the potential for, the increased competition coming into NC State's offense. And I think that in a lot of these cases, we see guys come in like there's not studs. It's not like Evan Stewart is coming in there or something like that. Like at the end of the day, it's guys who, they've been okay. Like Wesley Grimes been okay to this point. He was a pretty good guy coming in. I liked Noah Rogers coming in, but again, we don't really know like how great he is. At the end of the day, Casey Concepcion, I mean, he had a huge share of that offense last year as a true freshman, and he had a pretty solid 2.21 yards per team pass attempt as well. And I thought something interesting that Austin Devy Dietz at Campus again showed was that there was basically this list of like Power 5 freshmen that hit over 1.75 yards per team pass attempt, and it's all very impressive players who've done that as a freshman. And that is something that's like, if you use that as a threshold, well, Concepcion easily beat that last year. And he was used all over the field. Like he was a weapon in the backfield. And if you want to point to his low A dots, his low yards per reception, you can, but like that's because they literally had to use him in the backfield. Like he was being utilized also down the field, which we didn't see even out of like Luther Burden. Well, we actually saw that out of Casey Concepcion as a true freshman. It's just that there was just so many of these like screen passes and swing passes and stuff like that brought it down. So I don't think that truly represents the upside that he has as a more well-rounded wide receiver. I still don't think he's like an outside stud. I think he's more of like a slot type of guy going forward. But I think that with Grayson McCall coming in there, hopefully we get a little bit more of a competent passing attack this year. Concepcion isn't needed to be like that gadgety guy all the time. There's other weapons out there too. And I think it'll just help the offense as a whole. So I was pretty impressed by his playmaking abilities as a true freshman. I'm really hoping he just takes that to the next level. Even if his market share goes down a little bit, I think that just the production overall of the offense will allow for him for a much bigger year.
Yeah, I like the call. I kind of have Concepcion in that, like, I don't know what to think of him tier. Like when a true freshman goes out and does what he did, you have to take note. You have to. He obviously rises up the ranks, but then you start looking at the 8.5 A dot, which you already mentioned and everything, and it seems a little more gadgety than I like. I like receivers that are actually running routes and doing all that. And the problem is, now maybe you are saying like you've seen it in his game and you feel like he can actually run routes and do all that. All I'm saying is I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it truly happen yet. And so I like it. And he fits this pod perfectly because he is rising up ranks. He was not in my ranks or barely in my ranks. And now he is pretty damn high. But I don't know if I feel comfortable with it. It's kind of the same thing with Burden. It's Luther Burden-esque where he rose up the ranks for me, like, because I had him in like he's garbage, he's like wide receiver 100 for me, and now he's risen the ranks, pretty substantially. But I don't know if I believe it, and I want to see what happens, in another year. And do they use him differently? Does he actually start running routes? Does he do things like that? And I kind of want to see the same thing. The great news for Concepcion is he's a sophomore. He's a true sophomore. Like, he has plenty of time to show us, that he has that ability. And like you said, he's getting a QB upgrade. He's probably getting, coach upgrade. And like, I would assume like almost everything's being upgraded for him at this point. The only thing is, like you said, there's probably a little more competition. But, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I don't think, like you said, no one's coming in. Marvin Harrison Jr. is not coming in, to play on the other side from Concepcion here. So I'm not overly concerned about it. Hopefully it opens up the offense. Hopefully it helps out my boy Grayson McCall, at least for CFF purposes. And, I can go win a championship on the Campus Canton side, or on the campus side, I should say. But yeah, I do not mind that call at all. I want to be out on Concepcion, but Beth tells me that I can't be. Here we are.
And I think that Beth is smart there. And at least having him as one of those guys where it's like, let's wait and see, right? Like, let's at least consider him like, kind of, well, very interesting based on, how involved he was. But like you said, he needs to prove that like he can actually be like a functional wide receiver and not just, again, more of a low ADOT gadgety type guy, Rondale Moore, whatever you want to call him. So yes, he needs some development there, but at the end of the day, I saw some intermediate plays in the passing game, like not necessarily like a deep threat type of role, but like at least running down the field 10, 20 yards downfield as a route runner, which made me, and actually pulling off some nice receptions there, which made me kind of interested in him. That's for sure.
I like it. So I'm going to stick with the wide receivers here. And my riser is probably hilarious because I'm pretty sure he's fallen for almost everyone else, because everyone had this player, and I'm saying everyone with air quotes, but most people, a lot of people had Squirrel White really high last year going into his sophomore year. And I didn't really have him there. And I was like, all right, he's fine. He's small. Like, he didn't do that much as a freshman, like blah, 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 whatever. Well, now he goes out and he actually puts up like 800 and something yards this year, leads the receiving corps like substantially, like basically a one-man show for the most part, with Joe Milton, that we've already talked about, is a terrible, terrible quarterback. I mean, I saw him live at the Senior Bowl. He has the worst touch, and by the worst touch, I mean he has negative touch, where if you are 5 yards away from him, if you're 8 yards away from him, he will throw it 20 feet up in the air and 110 miles per hour, and that's just how he throws the ball. He's throwing picks in the actual Senior Bowl, just looking absolutely terrible. I mean, he is not an NFL quarterback. He's barely a college quarterback. He is a gigantic arm. That's essentially what Joe Milton is. And yet, Squirrel White actually goes out and puts up a pretty decent sophomore year, right? And then I feel like everyone's kind of like I mean, I don't hear anyone talk about him anymore. So I feels like he's fallen off for a lot of people. But he rose up the ranks for me because, I mean, maybe that was more on me because I didn't have him high enough. And that's fair. That's fine. But I mean, he's in, like, I have him one spot behind Trey Harris. I don't feel like obviously they're completely different players and different sizes and all that kind of stuff, not comparing the players, but I mean, as far as like how I feel about them, I don't feel like they're that far off. And I don't feel like that's the how the Devy world feels right now. But guess what? Everyone's really excited about Nico I coming in, being a huge upgrade for, over Joe Milton. Who's he throwing to? So I feel like we should be a little more excited about Squirrel White than I think a lot of people are right now.
Yeah, that's fair. And I am surprisingly still kind of high on him, or at least my ranks show that I am. Like, I just don't know what to do with the guy, right? It's like I didn't drop him down much, like you were saying. A lot of people did this this offseason because because of the high hopes, I was a little bit disappointed, yes. But I wasn't also so disappointed where I'm like, he's dead. he's like a terrible player. Like, no, got to understand the context of the offense, understand that, he's a little bit banged up last season and a slow start and all that type of thing. And Joe Milton couldn't hit him on a deep shot. Like the guy, like, Squirrel White is not the biggest guy. If the name doesn't give you that hint already, like Squirrel's kind of this, like, I mean, you need to be somewhat accurate as a quarterback to hit him. And that was not the case this year. So unfortunately, yeah, he didn't have the best showing, but he's still a top 20 guy for me right now at this time. He's actually just ahead of Trey Harris in my ranks. So I think that's an interesting range there. But yeah, I think that you can get a nice discount on Squirrel White now where you don't have to pay top 20 wide receiver prices, in startups and supplementals, etc. So very interesting guy there with Squirrel White. That's for sure. But do you want to touch on any other wide receivers here, John?
I have one more that is like somebody, and of course Toronto Dave with the squirrel emoji in the chat. Somebody that you should be, like I said, maybe it was my fault for not being high enough, but now I feel like I'm going to be that guy that's like, no, don't forget about him. But I have a player that was a true freshman last year. I don't know how to feel about him. It's another one of those guys where he didn't have the best quarterback play, unless you're asking Mike Valerie, who for some reason believes in Will Howard, like more than anyone else. But is it Jace or is it JC Brown? I think I've heard both, but I want to say Jace, but I feel like it could be JC. I don't know. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
he's looking it up.
I feel like I've heard. I don't know if I've heard JC. I don't know. Maybe I have, honestly.
All right. Well,
go ahead.
I screw up names, so I'm just going to say J.C. Brown, as he's always called, of course, was a true freshman. 16.2 yards per reception. You love to see that. I love looking at that athleticism. 440 yards in not the greatest offense. Will Howard is not very good. But they're getting, once again, kind of like what I was just saying with Squirrel White, they're getting an upgrade this year. I believe that I think everyone believes that Avery Johnson is a better quarterback than Will Howard. I believe that Avery Johnson's a better quarterback than Will Howard at the very least. And so I'm excited to see what he can do as, a young player who should get better, moving up and growing with the team, like that kind of thing. But, we see 2.3 yards per team pass attempt as a freshman. Perfectly acceptable, like stuff like that you love to see, and 14% market share, nothing crazy, but once again, a true freshman. So I don't have him extremely high. This is definitely more of like a sleeper-ish pick kind of deal. I'm not saying that he's like, my wide receiver one or anything like that. I'm just saying that I feel like it's a player that should at least be on radars for Devy, and I guess at the very least would be like campus to Canton viable, C2C viable, like that kind of thing. But I really feel like he showed enough to where he could actually be possibly Devy viable when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I like it. And he's a guy I truthfully have to dive into more. But I will give the listeners just a couple of other names as a little bit, maybe slightly deeper Devy risers, but still should be on the radar. And that's Tez Johnson, Oregon wide receiver. Now we know that Stewart's coming in there, so that does, kill a little bit of the buzz, a little bit of the rise that Tez Johnson could have, but he looked really good in that bowl game, and he made a huge impact despite being kind of a last-second transfer back over to Oregon to play with his adopted brother, Bo Nix. So I think at the end of the day, he can win all over the field. He's been good from a young age, right away in college. He transferred up in competition, so very similar to like what Trey Harris did, and he still looked really good considering he was playing with another guy in Troy Franklin who was a stud at Oregon. So Tez Johnson, at least on the radars, but again, it's deeper. I'm not saying he's a top 10, not saying he's top 15 type guy, but at the end of the day, I really like him a lot, and he just seems like a guy who works super hard and improves year after year. So I respect Tez, and I also think that CJ Daniels going from Liberty to LSU could be an interesting one to keep an eye on, just because he's always been an explosive player. I mean, he has a career 18.4 yards per reception, and unfortunately in 2022, his season was cut short, but in 2023, he really had a nice breakout season. He killed it with a 37% yards market share and a 3.52 yards per team pass attempt. Out of all the guys that we've talked about tonight, those are easily the best marks. Like he was really good. And CJ Daniels, I mean, LSU does not have proven talent right now at the wide receiver position. Like there's a huge opportunity there. And if Nussmeier is as good as some say, that is very interesting. And even if he's not, like John saying he's not, I mean, even if he's not, like I'm not saying he's going to be Jaden Daniels. Like Jaden Daniels had a very, very good season. And even if he's like 75% of that, like still there's a lot of volume there, passing wise, because we know that Nussmeier is not the rusher that Daniels is, that's for sure. So at the end of the day, I think that CJ Daniels going to LSU, he has he has enough size, he has enough athleticism, ability to really be their number one wide receiver. And we know we like LSU wide receiver ones most years. I think he's done enough for us to at least respect him as a deeper Devy riser at this point.
Definitely, you're loving the fifth year players tonight. I can tell you that. But I love the idea, the thought process. There's not that much going on there. He definitely stood out. Hollywood's in the chat again. He says the incoming freshman for Clemson. Is he talking about my boy TJ Moore? Is that who he's talking about?
Yeah, TJ Moore, huge riser. And honestly, Clemson's really interesting as a wide receiver room. I feel like we could spend a chunk of time on that alone. But yeah, TJ Moore, like Bryant Wesco is another incoming guy for Clemson who's super good. Like his comps that you'll see out there are kind of crazy, like CD Lamb and things like that. Like, I mean, Bryant Wesco has some. I mean, he's what, a 5-star in this class. Like Clemson's pulling some very, very good wide receivers. They already have Antonio Williams and Tyler Brown, and yeah, so that's an interesting room to try to not go off on a tangent, though. You're right that I did mention some of these older guys besides Casey Concepcion. I was tempted though to also include Eugene Wilson, Florida, but you can say a lot of the same things from what Concepcion's profile says. That you can say the same things for Eugene Wilson, right? Used underneath, kind of like a decent share, but maybe not quite as good as Concepcion. His yards per receptions, his underneath involvement's not maybe going to wow you, but the fact that he was involved, like Eugene Wilson at Florida, another very interesting guy who's been a riser for most. His price is getting uncomfortable at this point, though. He's going in round 2 in startups, or just super high from what I've seen. So I kind of like some of these guys you can get at a huge discount, like the Tez Johnsons, the CJ Daniels, again, Trey Harris. Like just nobody respects them, or nobody really values them that much. And I do feel like they're at least rising somewhat. I'm not into most 5th-year guys, but there are some certain ones where I'm like, okay, I could see how, with these extra years of eligibility and log jams at certain positions, etc., can allow for that.
No, I appreciate it, because you're not just saying this guy that's never touched the field is going to be amazing. He's rising up my board. Like, I mean, obviously we can say that and we can do that, but we don't know. No one knows. We're just kind of projecting at that point. At least you're talking about somebody that's actually done something on the field, proven who they are as a player, like that kind of thing. So I do appreciate it. I mean, even if I'm not used to you talking about the 5th-year players. If anything, I'm the one that ends up talking about the 5th-year guys most of the time.
Right. And what I'm going to say, like Brandon Inniss is a riser. It's like, no,
Right.
he's really not. Like he's a face planner who is in a super crowded situation with, like you said, maybe not the best quarterback even coming in there. So it's like, yeah. I'm sorry, but let's pour one out. Let's not call, Brandon Inniss a riser just because there's some opportunity there.
Exactly. All right, that's enough about the wide receivers. We'll talk more about the wide receivers as the time comes. Let's get into some of the running backs, because I think it's kind of interesting here, and we'll finish up, because I know you only had the one quarterback. I had 3, and 2 of them we've definitely never talked about on this pod. That's at the very least. So I think it'll be interesting and possibly exciting. But let's talk about the running backs first. A player I don't think we've talked about on this pod, but I've talked about somewhere, I believe, is Jonah Coleman out of Arizona. I feel like he rose up my ranks. I didn't even really hardly know who he was. He's going into his junior season now, out of Arizona. Like I said, he's a little short. I mean, he's 5'9", but he's 225. So he's that ideal size. You love to see it. Like, if anything, he's a little bigger than ideal size. He might even need to do a little more running, do a little more cardio or something. But But everything really stood out last year when Michael Wiley went down. Michael Wiley had an ankle injury. I actually interviewed him and talked to Michael about that, and he was saying how disappointed he was because he really felt like he could have had a great year, and that injury just hampered everything. And even when he came back, he just said he just didn't feel the same, and it just didn't really work out. Well, in steps Jonah Coleman, and really doesn't miss a step. Like almost looks at the same or maybe even a little bit better than Wiley, but at a younger age. As a true sophomore at the time. And you see the 8% big time run rate. Like I said, the huge 33 BMIs. I mean, we don't have to worry about size there. 2 receptions per game, so he's definitely a part of the receiving game there. 1.1 PPR points per touch. I mean, there's really nothing to hate about the profile. The only thing, like the last couple of games, they basically just said, okay, Wiley's back and we're going to give him the ball. And so he didn't really touch the ball too much the last couple of games of the season. But it wasn't like he got benched or anything like that. It was just like, hey, Wiley's back. We're going to give him his starting job back. I think it's going to be the Jonah Coleman show now. And I don't really think that there's any reason to think anything differently. And so, I mean, I guess there's some question marks about Arizona and like what else going on there. But, I'm not overly concerned about Coleman, the player. And so, I mean, he's definitely somebody, like I said, I didn't even hardly know who he was last year. So he has risen up my ranks quite a bit.
Yeah, and hopefully, at some point we mentioned him last year. Just I know that I've always liked Coleman, but it's never necessarily been something where I thought he was a stud or a star. But like, I mean, you look at some of these big guys who have just enough athleticism every year, and he's one of those guys where like he could maybe sneak in if he tests right and things fall right this year. He's gonna have the opportunity, and I've always liked him. Honestly, I've kind of forgotten about him a little bit this offseason because like the running back landscape is so deep. And I think that's my only issue with it is like, yeah, I mean, he's interesting for sure. He's going to be draft eligible, but so is like Ollie Gordon and Marion Hampton and like Trevor Etienne and Nick Singleton and Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson and Damian Martinez. And, I start going down the list and it's kind of crazy. Like Devin Neal, like a guy, like, why would he come back? Donovan Edwards. It's like, I go down the list and I'm like, I don't think that Coleman's quite better than any of those guys. Though, he was pretty efficient, yes, at Arizona. And, maybe it was partially the defenses he was playing too, allowed for a little bit of like inflated efficiency. But at the end of the day, I think that that's a good deeper call. And he's a guy that we shouldn't forget about completely. So might have to shift him back a little bit up in my ranks.
I like it. I guess I don't know how many of the running backs you have. I don't even necessarily want to touch on this player too much, but we have him here on the actual overlay, so I figured we should talk about Amarian Hampton a little bit at the very least. But he was a riser for me. I don't know if he was actually a riser for you because I know you were always a lot higher on him than I was, and so he's probably about the same, roughly. But I really wasn't a huge fan, especially after that freshman season. I was just like, I'm out. I wanted nothing to do with them. So I'm giving him his credit where it's due. Like he showed that he's at least a viable running back last year. I will say I'm a little concerned about the athleticism, the 6% big time run rate. That's a little concerning. But he has a lot of the stuff that we love to see with he's the right size and the receiving profile and showed the production part of it. So it's there. Like I said, I'm not saying he's amazing. I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm just saying that like I need to put some respect to his name because I definitely did not do that going into last year.
I appreciate that respect for sure because I've always been a Hampton guy and I guess nothing's really changed for me. So that's why I don't consider him a riser. But I think, like you said, in your case, or just in the case of a lot of folks who maybe didn't buy into him based on, what he presented as a recruit or what he did in that first season. I get it. Like he is a riser in the space in general, just like an Ollie Gordon, right? Oklahoma State. I guess we'd be silly not to mention him as an obvious riser. Whether you think he's an actual like legit NFL running back is another story. But I won't go into depth on Ollie Gordon because you probably hear about him and on all sorts of podcasts and he's just kind of another bigger name, but a guy who's slightly more slept on, Abu Sama, Iowa State's running back. And
That's my next player.
Yeah, there you go. I'm getting a little Yeah, little smile from John there. That's good. But, 5'11", 200 plus guy, um, higher 3-star back. And I thought this was interesting that he was a state champ in the long jump. He was second in the 60-meter dash state finals, and he had a 10.9 100-meter dash time in high school, which is fast. However, he was a little bit smaller at that point. He was like 190-ish, I want to say, or, a little bit thinner, but like he had pretty solid efficiency as a senior in high school. And then what he did this last year, with like the breakaway run rates and the yards per touch and, outproducing his backfield mates efficiency wise as a true freshman, that was pretty notable. And I thought that like he showed some power. He was competent as a receiver, though in kind of a lower volume role. Style wise, maybe he's not the most flashy guy, and he was a little bit inconsistent. But for a guy who's been called like an old school grinder, like no, he rips off some explosive plays, which I think is really interesting part of his profile. So Iowa State has that rich history at the running back position. I think that he is deservedly so a riser.
Yeah, he was my next guy, so I love the call. Um, Another one that I don't feel like we've talked about too much here on this pod, and and not to say that there was too many people talking about him before like the end of the season or anything like that, but yeah, just everything stands out. The only thing you can really say is it's kind of a small sample. He only has 91 attempts, so we need to see him take another step forward and or continue on this year and be that workhorse back that we want to see. But everything really, once again, he hits a lot of those thresholds that I love to see. So if he continues doing what he was doing this past year, he's gonna rise up everyone's boards, even mine. Like he's already risen quite a bit, but I've built in certain certain points into the model where it's like, hey, you have to get a certain amount of attempts before you really get a boost in it, and 100 attempts is one of those boosts. So he's 9 attempts away before he's gonna jump up a little bit even more. So it'll be fun to see what it can do this next year. And then I'm going to wrap up my running backs with a player that I've talked about quite a bit, but we can't talk about a Risers pod. We can't have a Risers pod and not talk about Dylan Sampson. It's impossible. I have loved Sampson for 2 years now, and I really felt like he should have had even more of a shot than he did last year. But for whatever reason, the coach just really wanted to have 4 freaking guys touching the ball, and maybe that's not going to go away. Maybe it's not just going to be the Dylan Sampson show this year, and that's fine. I don't even know if we necessarily want it to be the Dylan Sampson show, because he's not quite built for that workhorse, guy. He's not that kind of player. So maybe we don't want him to touch the ball 30 times a game, but maybe we want him to touch the ball 18 times a game, something to that effect. And if he does that, if he gets that kind of workload, the dude's just going to be a stud, and he's going to jump up everyone's boards. He's already, he's been pretty high for me this whole time. I've just been kind of waiting for him to get his shot, and he kind of got it last year. But, they still had Jalen Wright there. They still had Jabari Small there, taking reps for some reason. And then, today we find out he doesn't even get a combine invite. Like, come on, guys. Why are we giving him the ball? Like, what is this? I don't understand it. But it happened. But, man, every time Dylan Sampson touches the ball, it's electric. And I want to see more of that. And, even just beyond what I want to see, what I did see last year, he just keeps rising up the ranks.
Exactly. And to get maybe a little further in-depth look at him, check out the Campus to Canton Devy guide, which will be dropping, it's a little ways out actually. So not for a while, right? But in the future, check that out. Maybe somebody will write about him. Who knows? Mhm. Um, but I guess another. Okay, I was going to go with like bigger names here, maybe like an Ashton Gianti, Boise State, who I have as a top 8 back in this class, or actually overall, sorry, a top 8 back overall in Devy right now. So I have Gianti pretty high. He's rising for me. Jordan James, Oregon back, definitely rising for me as well. But I'll go a little bit deeper, and you might appreciate this guy. I don't know. You just dropped Dylan Sampson, who's a little bit smaller. Jaheim White, West Virginia. And, under the radar guy, undersized, understandably. Okay. He's not a workhorse guy. I think he'll be a little bit more of that like pass catcher, explosive guy who's maybe not going to get like a full workload, but like think of Devin a chain. Like I'm not saying that Jaheim White is that type of guy because he's not that type of track star or whatever. But at the end of the day, he has really high efficiency marks and explosive marks all over. Like, I mean, his highlights are fun. I mean, I want to see a little bit more of like the tackle breaking, the contact balance. Like, I mean, his burst is really fun. So at the end of the day, I'm really curious to see like if he continues just to get some high volume at West Virginia and what happens there. But at the end of the day, he's just a guy who's been rising for me, and I'm just keeping an eye on him. I'm not putting him up, exceptionally high yet, but what he did as a freshman was really, really interesting this year.
Yeah, actually, I mean, he stood out because I was looking through. I used to be the biggest C.J. Donaldson fan, and I kind of still am. But I was looking at Donaldson's season, and I'm like, man, he had a pretty good season, but like no one talks about him. He's just kind of off everyone's radars at this point. But he had a pretty good season. But then I'm like, well, wait, who's this Jaheim White guy? And so I'm looking at him, and I'm like, damn, he kind of stands out too. And then I looked at his size, and I'm like, okay. So, it's 5'7", 191 pounds. I think 192 pounds is what I have him listed at. That's just not going to cut it, And like we try not to be sizes here and everything, but when you're a running back, I mean, beyond obviously a receiving profile and everything, 5'7", 192 is probably, you feel like he's almost maxed out at that point. So it's like there's not going to be getting any bigger, I don't believe, or anything like that. So that's really the only thing holding him back, though. Like right now, he feels like an even poorer man's Gavin Sawchuk. Like insane burst and speed and all that kind of stuff, and just small and probably not ever going to be a thing in Devy. I wish him nothing but the best, but and also I guess it's probably more of a West Virginia thing, but not much of a receiving profile either. But we don't have that with Donaldson or anyone else, so I don't think he's a receiving back without being able to catch. Like I don't know, I don't love that profile.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just think that Jaheim White's like receiving skills were actually underrated. Like it wasn't high volume, but like I mean, he went for 125 receiving yards and 25 yards per catch and a few touchdowns this year. Like I get it. They're not really passing to the running backs at all. But yeah, at the end of the day, more of a change of pace guy. So I just wanted to mention him as a deeper guy because we know the NFL is moving away from some of these. Like they would rather have a really explosive 195-pound back rather than some of these 230-pound grinders. So I guess you're probably right that if you're looking for Devy true workhorse upside, like that's not the route you're going to go, right? You're not going to draft a guy like him. Maybe in a PPR league where you're really in the right scenario, I could see him making things kind of interesting in the future. But anyways, that's just a deep one, Jaheim White. But like I said, Jordan James, Ashton Gianti, those are some higher end risers for me as well.
No, I like the call. I mean, maybe somehow he can, get stretched a little bit, be like 5'9", 200, and then he'll probably be a little more Devy viable. But I mean, he's not like low in my ranks. He's just, it's like a guy that size can only get so high. So I mean, he almost has to be like perfect to move up any higher, and I don't think he's going to be perfect. So that's my only concern. But I don't mind the call, and especially for C2C purposes. I mean, he'll probably score at least a good amount of points this upcoming year. But I have a couple of quarterbacks for us here. Now, actually, technically I put 4. So I already talked about Jackson Dart. I already touched on Avery Johnson, but I felt like just mentioning him again. I feel like he's definitely a riser for me because, once again, just not a player that I really even had on my radar or anything like that. And he's, as far as I'm concerned, obviously, like Will Howard went on to bigger and better things, but there's a reason why Will Howard entered the transfer portal in the first place. Like I think it's because he kind of got the boot, and they were like, hey, Avery Johnson's actually better, so like get the hell out of here. So, or at least that's how I'm going to speculate, and that's how I'm going to, that's how it feels to me. So, but I'm trying to decide who to go with first here. So I have a player that has attempted 10 passes, and I have a player that has attempted 77 passes. Which one would you like first?
Oh boy, give me the 10. Give me the small sample size.
Okay, so This is a player that I honestly had no idea until like he popped up into the model, and I'm just like, oh, okay, that's interesting. It's Hank Brown out of Auburn, and I I think that he never touched the field until the bowl game, and he only had the 10 pass attempts. I think he had one pass attempt in another game, but he actually had 9 in that one game. He went 7 for 9 for like 100 and something yards and 2 touchdowns, and I mean, or I don't know, maybe he didn't even score a touchdown, but like everyone was talking about how amazing this like end of the game was because Peyton Thorne's just garbage, and whoever the other quarterback that came in is just absolute garbage. And at the end of the game, they're losing by like 4 touchdowns, and they're like, all right, let's throw in Hank Brown and see what he does. And he looked pretty damn good. The coach is talking him up. Everyone's just talking him up, saying how he's just amazing prospect. And it was obviously the smallest of samples, but the big time throw rate was up there in those 9 pass attempts, 10 pass attempts. The intended air yards were kind of up there and everything. But he's the projected starter this year. And so, while maybe we're not overly excited about Auburn anymore, I mean, it's still, it's still a quality team that they're going to have quality players. You could probably talk to me more about like whatever recruits they're bringing in and that kind of thing. But just reading up on the player and then reading about how the coach is talking about him, I'm pretty excited about him. And I mean, it's probably a player that you can get pretty damn cheap. I would assume, especially in Devy. I'm assuming that no one has Hank Brown rostered in Devy like that. I don't think that's the thing. So in like really deep Devy leagues and obviously in C2C leagues, somebody that'd be interested adding in supplemental drafts and everything. But for Devy purposes, if he can do anything like what he did, and I even went back and like looked at his high school stats and everything, like he was a pretty prolific high school player as well. So I mean, it's not like, oh, just like this, throw this guy in. He was a 3-star player, like there's reasons to believe that he can do it. He can take that step forward and be that guy. But once again, he's the presumed starter as of right now, like day one. So at the very least, he's so cheap that he can't hurt you, but like I said, it just seems like the excitement is infectious from like just reading a couple articles and everything, and that's why I'm all about Hank Brown now.
Yeah, hey, that is a deep one you're pulling there, and understandably not somebody who has been, somebody I've rostered or anything like that. At the end of the day, Hank Brown is. I gotta look into this guy now. I mean, I guess I don't really have much to say other than the fact that they are bringing in like a high end recruit in Walker White, who has, I mean, I guess a pretty significant name. Like I'd be surprised if Auburn is like, sorry, buddy, but you're never going to play because of Hank Brown. But I mean, I guess it could happen.
Well, I know a lot of people are really excited about White. I think we talked about him on the last pod. Even like you guys had mentioned his name. You and who do we have on?
Josh was talking.
Josh, yeah, Josh. Yeah, you guys were talking about him. But one more thing on Hank Brown, just to give you a little more, a little more confidence in him. He actually went to, I think it's Lipscomb High School, and he was coached by Trent Dilfer. And so Trent Dilfer was his coach and says he has all the skills to be an NFL quarterback. And obviously, like, he's probably going to say that about anybody. But I mean, I don't know about you. Like, Trent Dilfer was not an amazing quarterback himself, but if you've ever heard him speak, like, he is a smart guy. Like, he knows the quarterback position. He knows the NFL. He knows all that kind of stuff. And so somebody getting coached up by Trent Dilfer, that makes me feel a little bit better about him.
That's a good point there. And let's see your slightly smaller, but also still small sample size quarterback.
it's another small sample, but I mean, honestly, we have like 2 full games out of this player. And so at the end of the year, kind of like it's almost like perfect, an ideal situation where it's like, all right, now he's transitioning over to being the starting quarterback. And it's another player I went and looked up just to make sure. Not only is he listed as the starter on Our Lads, the coach actually already came out February 13th. We're recording this. He came out 6 days ago and said Nate Yarnell is our starting quarterback at Pitt. And so I was looking at, all right, like, okay, who the hell's Nate Yarnell, right? I'm looking at him. He took over the last couple of games of the season. He played against Duke and he played against Boston College. So not like the most amazing teams, but definitely not terrible teams. And I mean, basically, of who they're going to be playing against, probably like two of the higher end teams that they would be playing against in the ACC and everything. So, I mean, at least middle of the road, whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't like he was playing, Toledo or whoever. They were playing decent competition. He had 13.1% big time throw rate in those 77 attempts. 12.05 intended air yards. So he's throwing it down the field. Like he's slinging the rock. He's not just dinking and dunking or doing anything like that. He had a 1.3% interception rate, which is right in line with all the big name guys that we love. Your Caleb Williams, Drake Mays, any of those guys, those top players, right in line. 66% completion rate. And the dude just balled out. Like he really did. And I think even the adjusted yards per attempt, 15.4 adjusted yards per attempt. Now, I mean, that's going to come down. That's wild. That's never going to happen. That's not going to happen all the time. But it just shows that he has that big game ability, and he has what it takes to at least be on radars. And I told you, these last couple of guys are definitely sleepers, and they're not necessarily risers in the normal sense or whatever you want to call it. But it's just two players that I really wanted to mention, just in case they break out, that we can be like, hey man, we were in on these guys. But I mean, he had a 71% completion rate this season, like in those 77 attempts. But like I said, it's 2 full games in that sample, so you love to see that.
Hey, there you go. I mean, I love it, and I don't mind the depth there because we've went in depth tonight. And I'll say Connor Harrell, UNC quarterback. Another, I put my stamp on him for the season too. I mean, I think that's just a fun player in general. I'm pretty excited. So I think that you can find some of these quarterbacks who just haven't had a very large sample thus far, and there's some interesting aspects to their profile, and they could be big time breakouts in this wide open Devy quarterback landscape.
Absolutely. So you think UNC is just going to keep turning them out, huh?
I mean, Harrell's high school production was just so interesting, so under the radar. Like I'm kind of surprised he just wasn't a higher end recruit, and he has just a lot of things going for him, in my opinion. So yeah, I think that there's opportunity for him to be kind of next in line there, you could say.
Yeah, and just to end it with a name that people have actually heard of, I'll just say Lenore Sellers for obvious reasons. Like very small sample once again, but it seems like everyone, especially a lot of your C2C boys over there, just absolutely love him. And so I'm excited to see what he can do this year. It seems like they're building a pretty good squad around him and everything. So he should have all the tools to succeed and everything. We just have to see if he can continue what he did in those 4 passes that he actually attempted last year.
Right. Yeah, I have a hard time ranking him. I mean, like I was high on him early in the process, and I got him, late in leagues and supplementals, which was awesome. But now it's like, how high can I slot in a guy with that small of a sample size and some great physical tools, but you just don't know like how is he actually going to be as a quarterback. So at the end of the day, I think you got to shout him out as a guy who's risen. No doubt about that. It's just how high, right, is the question. So, I mean, I have him top 20 amongst Devy quarterbacks right now.
Yeah, I'm good with that. Actually, I have one last QB riser, and I actually feel like this is a good riser and kind of a sleeper, a potential sleeper for this upcoming year. And I feel like he's just not getting enough buzz for what he's already done in college, but then also where he's at now. And it's Dylan Gabriel going over to Oregon. And I feel like he's already put together a pretty solid college career. I'm not saying it's amazing. I'm not saying it's perfect or anything like that. But now he's going over to Oregon where everything's in place. Now, obviously, they're losing Troy Franklin. That's not great. But I mean, Oregon's going to be just fine. They have plenty of pieces there in place. In fact, maybe it's even gotten better, some might say. But regardless, I think that look who Bo Nix is as a player. Not the greatest. he's been getting first round buzz for a while now. Now it's starting to calm down now, and we've been saying pump the brakes on that one for a while now. Like I don't think you were ever a Bo Nix believer, and I definitely was not. Like I feel like he's the epitome of a game manager, and like that's it, like a career backup game manager, that kind of thing. It just really worked in that system with those players, the yak ability, all that kind of stuff. Now throw in Dylan Gabriel, who's actually shown that he can be a pretty good passer, pretty prolific player, and now throw in all these players that they're going to have around him, and the system, the coach is still there, all that kind of good stuff. Why isn't he being talked about more as a potential actual Devy player who's going to hit? It's a fifth year player, of course, but how many fifth year players have we talked about tonight? How many fifth year players have we talked about in the past couple of years as far as NFL quarterbacks? The NFL is just kind of saying, like, we get it. It takes time. We don't care. We want you to be a quarterback. We want you to win games for us. We don't care if it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. If you prove that you can do that, we want you on our team. So I feel like Dylan Gabriel is somebody that you should be able to go trade for, do whatever, and has a legitimate shot at being even maybe QB1 when this all said and done by the end of the year.
That is a bold one, and I think my only issue with Dylan Gabriel, like I think that you're going to be right that the production is going to take even a further step up. It's like if he hasn't been able to prove that through, however many seasons he's been in college so far, I think there's just something missing that the NFL really wants. And for me, I identify that as the arm strength thing, right? People think, of Bo Nix as this guy who has just a lot of rushing talent and a lot of, arm talent, when in the reality is, Bo Nix was not pushing the ball down the field. Bo Nix is not that accurate of a deep passer and not that skilled really overall as a passer. While I think that Dylan Gabriel is a better passer, I don't think he has that NFL arm velocity and strength and all those things. That's why he hasn't yet declared thus far through, however many seasons, super senior or whatever he is. But at the end of the day, he's going to have a really fun year. And you're going to, if nothing else, you're probably going to see him rise up in the same way that Michael Penix did. Right? People love Michael Penix, or at least loved until the national championship game. And imagine if he would have just been a little bit better for that game, or they weren't able to pressure him so much. Like Penix would still be up there as like, oh, this first round quarterback in this draft. Like he's going to be a stud. He's going to be a great fantasy option. Like I think that there's, some chance that Dylan Gabriel also has a very prolific season in that way. I think at some point though, we're going to see that he's just not quite the talent for like an NFL, high-end NFL role. But hey, I don't mind that call as far as like he probably will rise at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I was saying fifth year player, but he's actually going to be a sixth year player. So I mean, the odds are definitely going down each year. But like I said, we've seen the NFL be willing to kind of forgive that a little bit. So I don't want to hold it against him too much. And the thing is, like, he stands out in all of the categories that I want him to stand out in. But like you said, why hasn't he actually entered the NFL draft? That's the weird thing. And and sometimes it's just the NFL's already told him what they want to hear or don't want to hear, like that kind of thing. And it's like not comping the players, not comping the situations or anything like that. But I felt like a couple of years ago, Grayson McCall could have come out. And here we are. Grayson McCall's going into his 5th, 6th year, whatever it is. And, just everyone's really excited for him at NC State. But the odds of him actually being an NFL viable or Devy viable player have just, basically gone down to nil so far, or, now. So it's just one of those things. But I feel like I'm just seeing all the hype for Knicks and Oregon and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just like, well, what's going to change? And then that's the only reason why I'm like, hey, don't forget about Gabriel. So it's definitely somebody just like keep on your radar. And like I said, you could probably trade for him extremely cheap in a Devy league, especially. That's the whole point is, I mean, you could probably get him as a throw-in if he's even rostered for a lot of people. I mean, he could have been dropped easily at this point, and you might be able to just like pick him up or however, every Devy league's a little different, if you have waivers, if you don't, whatever it is. But I mean, like I said, just don't forget about him.
Yeah, good point there. Are there any tight ends that you want to mention?
Not really. I mean, Luke Hosh, I would say, but he was a freshman and he got hurt. I mean, it's hard to call him like a true riser, but I mean, he was blowing up, and he should be on radars and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, I don't know if there's any tight ends that I actually care about.
How about Harold Fannin Jr., Bowling Green tight end?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, like I said, I'm not overly excited about really any tight ends except for Hosh. Like he's the only one that like kind of stands out as like the possibility to be in that, not Brock Bowers level, but like maybe the tier below that or something like that. Like no other tight ends like truly standing out like that. And but I mean, we've talked about Fanning in the past, and he's definitely up there as like one of my higher end tight ends, but that's only saying so much.
Right, right. I just think that, whether you love him or hate him, I guess he is a riser, and ultimately like a versatile guy and productive guy to this point in what, 2 years into college, and can be kind of utilized all over. So he has a very interesting profile, and I think another year of really blowing up, and people actually will be taking note and saying, "Wow, this guy could be, even like a day two type of tight end, in the NFL draft." So, I think Fannin is interesting, if nothing else. But like you said, the tight end position right now, it's just so much is up in the air, and I don't really have like a strong other guy that I'm going to propose as like a huge riser either. It's just kind of a everybody keeps saying how deep it is. I just think it's kind of bland, right? In general. Like, I mean, you can call that deep if you want, but it's not overly attractive like it has been in some years with some studs.
Yeah, you're really bringing us down with the tight end talk here. A name that we mentioned in the past, but Justin Jolly or Justin Jolie, whatever, however you ever say his name, he's definitely a riser for me. But like I said, you're really bringing us down here with the tight end talk. We
Oh,
we tried to end on Dylan Gabriel, Oregon, excitement, and then you were like, "Hey, tight ends exist."
oh man, we need an exciting name to end the show on. Like just a little, little bow there. But maybe we've already talked about him enough. But maybe not Trevor Etienne, because a lot of people already liked him. He's not really rising. I mean, like he could rise up more. I mean, that's a great landing spot at Georgia, right? But um, hmm, and maybe it's just not going to happen, right? Maybe we just have to end on a sad note.
All right, so it's kind of a cop out because he really hasn't done. It's extremely small sample, but I'll say for me, and I mean it's kind of dumb because he was a high end prospect, but Jalen Hale for Bama is a riser for me because we actually saw him do a little bit of something. He only ran like 70 something routes, so not all that great as far as like production wise or anything like that. But we also know that Jalen Milroe is not the greatest quarterback, and so for the little bit of production that he did, putting up 24 yards per attempt or yards per reception and like things like that, that's what I like to see, even if it's not in a huge sample size. 4.5 PPR points per touch, that's really exciting. So I obviously I would love to see it not be Jalen Milroe at the at the helm, and maybe we will see that. Who knows? Like we don't know exactly what's going down with Bama, and I mean, like I said, it's kind of a cop out answer, but I did not want to end on tight ends, so I'll say Jalen Hale was a riser for me because at least we saw him do. He broke those year one thresholds that that we worry about, the year 1-0 thresholds that the campus Canton worries about. He broke all that kind of stuff, and like I said, he looked pretty damn explosive while doing it. So he's somebody that I'm very interested in seeing what he can do in the future.
Yeah, that's a good call out, and that's a very attractive one because he was a true freshman this last season, like you said. And I think that even talking about like Deuce Robinson, Nick Harbor, Nick Anderson, some of these young guys, right? I think some of them are certainly eligible to be considered a riser at this point. So that should be a little bit more exciting to cap things off, huh?
I like it much better. All right, well, we're about almost an hour and a half here, and so I think we did a pretty good job of explaining and giving you our risers here. Hopefully, you guys learned some names to at least write down there. Like I said, you don't have to go out and buy these players, add these players, do whatever right now, but at least have them on your radars. But there's a couple of those players that you probably should go ahead and try to trade for, pretty soon, before they start touching the field, and their values are just going to go or skyrocket at that point. So we appreciate you guys listening as always. Hopefully you enjoyed this. I can't wait to give you more Senior Bowl, stuff, more stories. I have a lot that I've already left out, so we'll have to talk about the Senior Bowl a little bit more. We'll just mix it in with anytime we talk about a player that was at the Senior Bowl that I have a story about. You better believe I'm going to have that story pop up and I'll have it for you. But Aaron, any words of wisdom before we get out of here?
No, other than, startup season, supplemental season, all that is coming up here. So even like John said, you don't have to go make a trade necessarily. You don't have to go put that work in if you don't want to right now for some of these players. Maybe they're available in your upcoming Devy draft or whatever the case is. So just kind of file away these guys as if they were under your radar, or if you hadn't really updated ranks, whatever the case is. Understand that these guys might be a little bit slept on at this time.
Absolutely. Well, once again, we appreciate you guys listening. We will be back in your ears as soon as possible. But for now, we're going to go ahead and cash out. See you guys.